Hey there, you guys ready for chapter 4? Chapter 4, the day of judgment. Normally the day of judgment means like judgment day, that's like the day you die. I wonder. This is 1932, the next summer. I don't think Grandma's a very good influence on us, Mary Alice said. It had taken her a while to come to that conclusion, and I had to agree. It reconciled us some to our trips to visit her. Mary Alice was 10 now. I believe this was the first year she didn't bring her jump rope with her. And she no longer pitched a fit because she couldn't take her best friends, Beverly and Audrey, to meet Grandma. They wouldn't understand, Mary Alice said. We weren't so sure Mother and Dad would either. Since we still dragged our heels about going, they didn't notice we looked forward to the trip. The gooseberries were ripe when we got there that August, and come to find out, Grandma was famous for her gooseberry pies. Mary Alice and I were stemming berries at the kitchen table that first morning. I imagine stemming berries means removing the stems. Grandma was supervising a pan of them on the stove. The gooseberries popped softly as they burst open in boiling water. Then somebody knocked on the front door. Grandma ran an arm across her forehead and started through the house. We'd have followed, but she said, "Keep at it." When she came back, Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, was right behind her. If she thought she was going to be asked to sit down, she had another think coming. Grandma returned to the stove, leaving Mrs. Weidenbach beached by the kitchen table, where she overlooked Mary Alice and me. She was big on top, though nowhere near as big as Grandma, but she had tiny feet teetering in high-heeled shoes. The heat of the kitchen staggered her, but then people from Death Valley would have keeled over in Grandma's kitchen. "Mrs. Dowdell, I am here on a mission," she said, "and I'll come right to the point." "Do that," Grandma said. "As you know, this is County Fair Week," Mrs. Weidenbach said. "The annual opportunity for our small community to make its mark." Grandma said nothing. "As you recall," Mrs. Weidenbach said, "my bread and butter pickles have taken the blue ribbon every year since the fair recommenced after the Great War." If Grandma recalled this, she gave no sign. "But my cucumbers this year haven't been up to snuff. Not worth the brine for pickling. How were yours?" "Didn't put any in," Grandma said. "Ah, well, you were wise." Mrs. Weidenbach's forehead began to look slick. It seems like maybe she's after something. It wasn't just the heat. "Mrs. Dowdell, I'll come clean. I don't think I better enter my bread and butter pickles this year, and I'm going to tell you why. The Depression is upon us. Times are hard." "They was never easy for me," Grandma recalled. "And quite unfairly," Mrs. Weidenbach said. "People blame the bankers." "My stars," Grandma said. "The bank forecloses on people's farms and throws them off their land, and they don't even appreciate it." "Now, Mrs. Dowdell, don't be like that." Mrs. Weidenbach reached down the front of her dress and plucked out a lace handkerchief. She dabbed all around her mouth. "Mr. Weidenbach has asked me not to enter my bread and butter pickles into competition at the fair this year." "Keep your head down till the Depression blows over?" "Something like that," Mrs. Weidenbach murmured. "So I naturally thought of you. After all, we've been neighbors these many years." The Weidenbachs lived at the far end of town, in the only brick house. I said to my husband, Mr. Weidenbach, somebody must carry home a blue ribbon to keep our town's name in front of the public. Otherwise, those county seat women will sweep the field. As you know, Mrs. Cowgill's decorative butter pats never do better than honorable mention. If Grandma knew who won what at the county fair, she showed no sign. But there is nobody to touch you for baking with gooseberries. Even those of us who've never had a taste have heard. Word gets around. Try as a person will to keep it quiet, Grandma said. Gooseberries are tricky things, Mrs. Weidenbach went on. Now you take Mrs. Votsmeyer over at Bement. She wouldn't take on a gooseberry, but she'll pull down a blue ribbon in the fruit pies and cobblers division with her individual cherry tarts if somebody doesn't put a stop to her. Quiet followed as we listened to Grandma's wooden spoon scraping the sides of the stew pan. At length, she said, I cook to eat, not to show off. Mrs. Weidenbach sighed. Mrs. Dowdell, these are desperate times. Don't hide your light under a bushel. It is up to you to hold the banner for our town. So she's wanting Grandma to put her gooseberry pies in the fair so that someone from their town can win a blue ribbon at the county fair. That's not really Grandma's jam, is it? Grandma putting herself out for the fame of the town? I thought Mrs. Weidenbach was on the wrong track. On the other hand, Grandma liked to win. Growing frantic, Mrs. Weidenbach let her gaze skim over Mary Alice and me. And a day at the fair would be a nice outing for your grandkiddies. Wouldn't cut any ice with them, Grandma said. They're from Chicago, so they've seen everything. Instantly, an expression of great boredom fell over Mary Alice's face. I thought she might yawn. She was playing along with Grandma. I'd been thinking a day at the fair would be a welcome change, but I just shrugged and went on stemming gooseberries. Grandma turned slightly from the stove. Wouldn't have any way to get there if I wanted to go. Mrs. Weidenbach brightened. I will personally conduct you to the fair on Prize Day in my Hupmobile. She waved a hand in benediction over us. And there'll be plenty of room for your grandkiddies. Oh, well, Grandma said, if I have an extra pie and it's not raining that day. Mrs. Dowdell, I knew you would stand to deliver. Mrs. Weidenbach clasped her hands. And remember, even the red ribbon for second prize will be better than nothing. Grandma gazed past her, seeming to count the corpses on the flypaper strip. Mrs. Weidenbach was dismissed and soon left. We all listened to the powerful roar as she ground her Hupmobile into gear. Grandma's sleeves were already turned back, or she'd be turning them back now. She pointed to me. Scoot uptown and bring me a 25-pound sack of sugar. Tell them to stick it on my bill. After that, I want every gooseberry off them bushes out back. She turned on Mary Alice. And you're going to learn a thing or two about pie crust. There followed 3 of the busiest days of my young life. Wrestling 25 pounds of sugar back from Moore's store was nothing to picking all the gooseberry bushes clean. As Mrs. Weidenbach said, gooseberries are tricky things, sour to the taste, and spiky with stickers. Not unlike Grandma. My throbbing hands were covered with sticker wounds from getting all the gooseberries into the pail. With towels around their middles and their hair tucked up, Grandma and Mary Alice rolled out endless pastry on big breadboards. We baked a gooseberry pie every 4 hours for the next 3 days. I had about all I could do to feed corn cobs into the stove to keep the oven heat even. Gooseberries are so tart that more sugar than fruit goes into the pie. Some pies were still too sour, others gritty with too much sugar. We tried again and again. Grandma grew... Josie, sorry. Shh. Grandma grew careful about balancing her ingredients, holding the measuring cup up to the light. She was like a scientist seeking the cure for something. I had to go back uptown for more sugar and another big can of Crisco. And we had to sample them all in search for the perfect pie. Mary Alice says she's never since been able to look a gooseberry in the face. The day of judgment came. Mary Alice and I were in the parlor early, waiting. Grandma had told us to cover our heads against the fairground sun. I had on the Cubs cap I traveled in, and Mary Alice wore her straw hat from Easter. The house reeked of baking. Then Grandma sailed like a galleon into the front room, striking us dumb. A galleon is like a big ship with sails. So she's coming in and striking us dumb. That's not like stupid, it's like can't talk. For her, dressing up usually meant taking off her apron. But this morning, she wore a ready-made dress covered with flowers. The collar was fine net, fixed with a big cameo brooch that rode high, a fancy pin up here. On her feet were large, unfamiliar shoes, white with the hint of a heel, and laces tied in big perky bows. On her head was a hat with a big brim. The hat band on it happened to be a blue ribbon. She glared, daring us to pay her a compliment, but the cat had our tongues. Mary Alice stared up at her transfixed. Was she seeing herself 50 years hence? The Hupmobile growled up outside, and the next thing you knew, we were in it. It wasn't as long as Al Capone's big Lincoln limousine, but it was the biggest car in this town. Mary Alice and I had the back seat to ourselves. The pie was in a box between my feet. Grandma took charge of a small hamper full of our lunch, since they charge you 2 prices for everything at a fair. She rode up front beside Mrs. Weidenbach, with one big elbow propped outside the open window. The town had emptied out because this was prize day at the fair. But when we went by the Coffee Pot Cafe, there were faces at the window, and a loafer or two paused on the sidewalk to see us pass. Grandma inclined her head slightly. Most people wouldn't take their bows till after they'd won a blue ribbon, but Grandma wasn't most people. The fairground was a pasture along a dusty road this side of the county seat. So a county seat is like the main town in a county. So in big counties, there's usually a couple smaller towns, and the county seat is where the government buildings are for that county. I'm pretty sure that Charlotte is the county seat of Mecklenburg. The city of Charlotte kind of takes up quite a lot of Mecklenburg County. In more rural counties, the towns are much more spread out. But the county seat is always the biggest town in a county. The fairground was a pasture along a dusty road this side of the county seat. It was a collection of sheds and tents and a grandstand for the harness racing. But this was the big day for judging cattle, quilts, and cookery, so the grounds were packed, though it was a nickel to get in. Mrs. Weidenbach twinkled along in her high heels next to Grandma. She didn't dare show her pickles, but she wanted some reflected glory in case the gooseberry pie won. Let's run that pie over to the Domestic Sciences tent and get it registered, she said. I don't want it setting around, Grandma said. The livestock draws flies. The pie was no burden to Grandma because I was carrying it. Let's see something of the fair first, she said, managing to sound uninterested. She's probably pretty interested. Along the midway, the Anti-Horse Thief Society had a stand selling burgoo and roasting ears. Burgoo is a kind of stew, I think. Roasting ears, that's corn on the cob. The 4-H Club was offering chances on a heifer. That's a cow. You could win a cow. Alice Chalmers had a big tent showing off their Huskers and combines. Alice Chalmers is a company that makes farming equipment. Huskers and combines are like big tractor-looking things. Prohibition was about to be repealed, but the temperance people had another big tent offering ice water inside and a stage out front with a quartet performing. At the other end of the midway was a rickety Ferris wheel, a merry-go-round, and a caterpillar. I imagine a caterpillar is a ride. Beyond it was a sight that drew me. In an open stubble field, a biplane stood. That's a biplane. One of those airplanes with 2 sets of wings, one on top and one on bottom. They're usually open like this. Beside it was the pilot, in a leather helmet with goggles and puttees wrapped around his legs, and a sign, Barnstorming Barney Buchanan, Air Ace, Trick Flying and Passenger Rides. My heart skipped a beat and sank. Another sign read, Rides, 75 cents. Joey didn't have 75 cents. It's kind of a lot of money. I didn't have that kind of money on me. I didn't have any money on me. Still, my heart began to taxi. I'd never been in a plane, and my hero was Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, who'd flown the Atlantic alone. The American Legion was sponsoring Barney Buchanan. A red-faced man in a Legionnaire's cap bawled through a megaphone, "Tell you what I'm gonna do, folks. Any minute now, Mr. Buchanan is going to show us his stuff by putting his machine through the same maneuvers he used in the Great War against the wily Hun. Then, if you think 6 bits is still too steep, Mr. Buchanan has agreed to a special prize day offer. To every blue ribbon winner, Mr. Buchanan will give a ride in his plane for free. Free of charge, ladies and gentlemen." My heart left the ground, skimmed a hedgerow, and sailed into the wild blue yonder. The pie in my hands would win first prize, since nobody but Grandma would take a chance with gooseberries. But she'd let me have her plane ride because she was too old and too big. "You reckon that thing will get off the ground?" she said doubtfully, building my hopes higher. "It looks like a box kite," Mary Alice said. "A person would have to be nuts to go up in it." The biplane's wings were canvas-covered and much patched. It was more rickety than the Ferris wheel. Still, it was a plane, and this looked like my one chance in life to go up in one. Now Mrs. Weidenbach was plucking at Grandma's arm, and it was time to enter the pie into competition. When we went into the domestic services tent, Grandma remarked, "I said there'd be flies." Surrounded by crowds, the long tables were all laid out, jams and preserves, vegetables in novelty shapes, cakes and breads. A half-sized cow carved out of butter reclined on a block of melting ice. It was as hot as Grandma's kitchen in the tent, so people fanned paper fans, compliments of Brochier's funeral home, each with the Brochure motto printed on it: "When you come to the end, you'll find a friend." It's an interesting funeral home motto. Mrs. Weidenbach averted her eyes as we passed the pickled products. I took charge of unpacking the pie and getting it registered at Fruit Pies and Cobblers. Grandma started at the other end of the table, casting an eye over the competition. Everything looked good to me, and I was wishing I was a judge so I could have a taste. A little card with a number and a name stood beside each entry. When she got to her own pie, Grandma froze. Next to it was another lattice-topped gooseberry pie. Lattice-topped, that's like when there's sort of a checkerboard pie crust pattern on the top of a pie. Somebody else has entered a gooseberry pie in the competition. There was no doubt about it. Only gooseberries are that shade of gray-green. And it was a very nice-looking pie. The edges of its pastry were as neatly crimped as Grandma's. Maybe better. She bent to read the card and whipped around. I followed her look as it fell on one of the smallest people in the tent. It was a man, one of the few there. A little tiny man. He wore small bib overalls, a dress shirt, and a bow tie. 4 or 5 strands of hair were arranged across his bald head. "Rupert Pennypacker," Grandma breathed. You seldom saw her caught off guard. Was he responsible for the other gooseberry pie? "Who?" I said. "The best home baker in the state of Illinois," Grandma said. "Him and me come up together out in the country, so I know." Mrs. Weidenbach quaked. Even Mary Alice looked concerned. "I'm a goner," said Grandma. A puttering sound deafened us. It was Barney Buchanan, the air ace, right over our heads. He was doing his aerial stunts, barrel rolls and vertical figure eights, or whatever he did. Everybody looked up, though we could only see tent roof. It was just a moment, but somehow I was sure. In that split second, when we'd all looked up, I thought Grandma had switched her pie's card with Rupert Pennypacker's. It was a desperate act, but as Mrs. Weidenbach had said, these were desperate times. It was the wrong thing for Grandma to do, but I might get a plane ride out of it. My head swam. Grandma nudged me away from the table and elbowed through a parting crowd. She was making for Mr. Pennypacker. I wondered if she'd reach down, grab him by his bib, and fling him out of the tent. With Grandma, you never knew. "Rupert," she said. Standing beside him was the scariest-looking old lady I'd ever seen. Weirder than Aunt Puss Chapman. She was only a little taller than Mr. Pennypacker and dressed all in black, including the veil on her hat. She had warts, and her chin met her hat brim. She got kind of a high, pokey-out chin. There was a lump in her cheek that looked like it might be a bunch of chaw. That's like chewing tobacco. "You remember Mama," Mr. Pennypacker said to Grandma. His voice was high, like it had never changed. My voice hadn't changed either, but I was 12, so I still had hope. By voice changing, he's talking about when a boy gets a little older and their voice gets deep. But Rupert Pennypacker still has a really high-pitched voice. His old mama hissed something in his ear and tried to pull him away with a claw on his arm. "Well, may the best man win," Grandma said, turning on her heel. By now, the judges were at work. They carried little silver knives and miniature trowels for sampling the cobblers and pies. Tension mounted. Nervously, Mrs. Weidenbach said to Grandma, "What a nice, moist consistency your pie filling has, Mrs. Dowdell. I'm sure it will be noted. How much water did you add to the mixture?" "About a mouthful," Grandma replied. I think she's kidding. The judging went on forever, but nobody left the sweltering tent. We all watched the judges chewing. Finally, Mary Alice said she thought she might faint, so I took her outside. Up among the clouds, Barney Buchanan was still putting his old biplane through its paces. He dived to the earth and pulled up in time. He gave us 3 loops and a snap roll, and my heart was up there with him, scouting for Germans. A voice rose from inside the tent, followed by gusts of applause. They were announcing the winners. Honorable mention, 3rd prize, 2nd, 1st. I didn't want to go back in there. I hoped we'd win, but I wasn't sure we should. Not if Grandma had switched. The tent quivered with one final burst of applause. People began streaming out, flowing around us. Then out strolled Mr. Pennypacker and his mama, clutching him. You couldn't read anything in that face of hers, but Mr. Pennypacker was beaming. From the clasp on his overall bib hung a blue ribbon. "Shoot," Mary Alice said. "After all that pie crust I rolled out?" In a way, I was relieved. But then I saw my one and only chance for a plane ride crash and burn. Mr. Pennypacker was already heading for the field where the biplane was coming in for a landing. At last, Mrs. Weidenbach and Grandma came out. A nod from Grandma sent me back to the Hupmobile for our hamper of lunch. We ate it at the table in the temperance tent. Sliced chicken washed down with ice water. Grandma had her great stone face on, but Mrs. Weidenbach tried to make the best of things. "Never mind, Mrs. Dowdell. As I have said, a red ribbon for 2nd place is not to be sneezed at or scorned. You did right well." But Grandma hadn't come to the fair for 2nd prize. She didn't wear it, if she'd bothered to collect it at all. And you are up against stiff competition," Mrs. Weidenbach said. "I dare say Rupert Pennypacker has had nothing to do all his life but wait on his dreadful mother and bake." Consoling Grandma was a thankless task. She ate her chicken sandwich with her usual appetite, observing the crowds. If I could read her mind at all, she was thinking she could do with a cold beer. The day seemed to have peaked and was going downhill now. As we left the temperance tent, the quartet was still singing. We were ready to head for the parking pasture, but Grandma turned us the other way, toward the midway and the biplane. "What?" said Mrs. Weidenbach, but fell silent. We were walking through the fair, and something inside my ribcage began to stir. There ahead, the biplane was on the ground. Afternoon sun played off the dull mahogany of its propeller. Something within me dared to dream. I wasn't swooping. I didn't even taxi, but I was walking lighter. Giving blue ribbon winners free rides hadn't stimulated much business. Barney Buchanan was lounging beside his plane. He was smoking a cigarette in his hand, pilot style. Grandma strode past the ticket table. out onto the field. She paused to look the plane over from prop to tail, then she glanced briefly down at me. I didn't dare look up at her, but my hopes were rising. Then she marched forward. When Barney Buchanan saw Grandma bearing down on him, he tossed away his cigarette. "I'm a blue ribbon winner," Grandma announced. "Here for my ride." "What?" Mrs. Weidenbach said. My brain went dead. "Well, ma'am," Barney Buchanan said uncertainly, noticing her size. "And what class did you compete in?" "Fruit pies and cobblers." She held up a crumpled blue ribbon clutched in her fist. She gave him a glimpse of it, then dropped the ribbon into her pocketbook. "Well, ma'am, it seems to me I've already given a ride to a man who won first in pies," he said. "A little fella." "Oh, that's Rupert Pennypacker," Grandma said. "You got that turned around in your mind. He won in sausage and head cheese. Don't I look more like a pie baker than him?" Grandma reached up to pull the pin out of her hat. She handed the hat to Mary Alice. "Here, hold this. It might blow off." I saw the hat band was missing from her hat. The blue ribbon. It took 3 big members of the American Legion and Barney Buchanan to get Grandma into the front cockpit of the plane. That's the front seat of one of these planes. Eventually, the sight drew a crowd. The Legionnaires would invite Grandma to step into their clasped hands, then boost her up. That didn't work. Then they'd hoist her up some other way, but she'd get halfway there and her hindquarters would be higher than her head. They had an awful job getting her into the plane, and they were wringing wet. But at last, she slid into the seat to a round of applause from the crowd. Grandma was a tight fit, and the plane seemed to bend beneath her. Barney Buchanan stroked his chin. But then he pulled his goggles over his eyes and sprang up to the rear seat. He could pilot the plane from there, if he could see around Grandma. A Legionnaire jerked the propeller, and the motor coughed twice, then roared. Mrs. Weidenbach was between Mary Alice and me now, clutching our hands. A lot of Grandma stuck up above the plane. The breeze stirred her white hair, loosening the bun on the back. Her spectacle lenses flashed like goggles. She raised one hand in farewell, and the plane began to bump down the field. Now my heart was in my mouth. Everyone's was. The biplane, heavy burdened, lumbered over uneven ground, trying to gather speed. It drew nearer and nearer the hedgerow at the far end of the field. "Lift!" the crowd cried. "Lift!" Mary Alice's hands were over her eyes. But then distant dust spurted from the plane's front wheels. The tail rose, but dropped down again. It had stopped just short of the hedgerow, and now it was turning back. We watched the bright disk of the whirling propeller as the biplane returned to us. Barney Buchanan dropped down from the cockpit. He looked pale, shaken. But they had to get Grandma down from the plane, and getting her out was twice the job of getting her in. She'd plant one big shoe on a shoulder and the other on another. They had her by the ankles, then the hips. She tipped forward and back, and her pocketbook swinging from her arm pummeled their heads. She brought 2 big men to their knees. At last, she was on solid ground, scanning the crowd for me. She crooked a finger, and I went forth. As always, I couldn't see a moment ahead. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," Barney Buchanan was saying to Grandma, "but I was just carrying a little more freight than this old crate could handle." Grandma waved that away. "Don't give it a thought. You can take my grandson instead, she said, if he wants to go. The heavens opened. I thought I heard celestial music. Ah! Somehow, I was up in the front seat of the plane, buckling myself in with trembling hands. And Barney Buchanan was handing me up a pair of goggles. Goggles from the Great War. Now we were taxiing, Barney and me, bumping over the ground, gathering speed behind the yearning motor. And I felt that moment when we left the ground and the fair fell away below us, and ahead of us was nothing but the towering white clouds. And beyond them, sky, endless sky. I didn't know there was that much sky as we flew, Barney and me, in stuttering circles, higher than birds over the patchwork fields. That night, Mary Alice went up to bed early, tuckered out. Still in her fair finery, Grandma sat in the platform rocker, working out of her shoes. They'd been a torment to her all day. Now she kicked them aside. If I could pop all the corns on my toes, she said, I could feed a famine. I'd settled on the settee. Okay, that's gross. The corns on her toes. I could feed a famine. I just realized, ew. Corns are like blisters, sort of, on your toes. Anyway, I'd settled on the settee, watching her in the circle of light, after the big doings of the day. Grandma, I said at last, I've got a couple of things on my mind. Well, spit them out, she said, if you must. About your plane ride. You never did expect it to get off the ground, did you? Lands, no. She turned down a hand. When I was dainty enough for a plane to lift, they didn't have them. We couldn't have dusted the crops with me on board. I just wanted to see what it felt like sitting up there in that hen roost. Cockpit, Grandma, I said. Then you meant for me to have the ride all along? Grandma didn't reply. And another thing, I've got a confession to make, I said. I know you wanted first prize on that pie. You wanted it bad. And I thought you'd switched the card on Mr. Pennypacker's pie with yours so you could win with his pie. She shot me her sternest look, but then, easing back in the platform rocker, she said, I did. Grandma. End of chapter.